education. I have received my BA in archaeology from the University of Belgrade in Serbia and my master and PhD at Indiana University in Bloomington. My research is focused on Aegean prehistory, history of Greece, and I've been working there since more or less 2004. In that period, I have done 6 different projects in Greece, including both excavations and surveys. And this is the one that I am currently working on. There's another one, a survey of the Cycladic Islands, which is not going to be the focus of this talk. This is the excavation currently ongoing under the sponsorship of the Norwegian Institute at Athens. All right, it works. As I said, the project called Gourimadi Archaeological Project, or as we lovingly call it, GAP, is a single project by the Norwegian Institute at Athens with a permit from the Norwegian Institute at Athens, or through the Norwegian Institute in Athens, actually, which is part of the University of Bergen. The permit comes from the Greek Ministry of Culture. This is how it's set up over there. So how it works, the Norwegian Institute applies for a permit for archaeological research or any other kind of archaeological work, and the ministry issues the permit, and we were fortunate to receive one. Just to tell you a couple of words about the Norwegian Institute at Athens, for those of you who don't already know it or have not been there, it is now fully part of the University of Bergen. Before, it was founded as a joint project by 4 major Norwegian universities, Bergen, Oslo, Trondheim, and Tromsø. These are some of the things that the Institute does. If you ever get a chance to go there, I warmly recommend it. You will be met by some wonderful people. They will help you in your research. But the Institute focuses on archaeological research primarily, but also supports research in humanities, social sciences, and other fields. Also supports education. At the moment, actually, there is a class from the philosophy department there in Athens, here from Bergen. Engages in cultural diplomacy, Norwegian culture in Greece, in collaboration with the Norwegian embassy in Athens. Supports students and scholars from Norway in many ways. Hosts students in Norwegian courses. It disseminates research results, particularly through lectures, conferences, seminars, and a wonderful, ongoing for more than 3 decades now, publication series. Also, Norwegian Institute at Athens participate in the Nordic Library, together with the institutes of Finnish, Danish, and of Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. They jointly manage this wonderful research space. It's one of the best research libraries in that part of Europe. And it's also part of this so-called foreign schools or institutes community in Athens, which is kind of a unique situation where you have scholars from 19 different countries working on prehistory, archaeology of classical times, scientific archaeology, all focused in Athens together with their colleagues from Greek universities and other Greek institutions. So you have this situation that you have this brain power that is unrivaled in many other places in the world. Now, since I assume most of the people here are not very familiar with Greek prehistory, I'm just going to give you a short introduction of to give you like a time frame and geographical frame of the project. The site that we're excavating now is dated to the late Neolithic through the very beginning of the Early Bronze Age I period in Greece. This is about 2,000 years of Greek prehistory. We are very fortunate to have such a long span of years or in cultural use of one site. This is not easily found, especially this late in the Neolithic. Now, a little bit about the Neolithic in Greece. It's one of the earliest in Europe. It starts about 7,000 to 3,000 BC, and nobody hold me to this. I mean, there's a dispute a couple of hundred years earlier, later. But generally speaking, you know, this is the Neolithic in Greece. It's subdivided into early, middle, and late, and final. Final is a contentious topic. We'll get to it in a minute. It starts with the introduction of agriculture in the Aegean and Greece from the Near East, likely through population movements. There's also other theories that only the idea of the Neolithic, of producing food and raising animals, have spread instead of the people, and that the people, they're actually bearers of the Neolithic in Greece, were there already through the Paleolithic and Mesolithic. The data we have now largely doesn't support this, but I'll leave the discussion for another time. There are two possible migration routes. Originally, the main migration route was thought to be through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles here, the land route, also involving a short sea crossing, and then it spread into Greece and the rest of the Balkans outside of this map. But more and more, it seems to be that one of the important, if not the important route of the spread of the Neolithic was maritime, through the Cycladic Islands from Asia Minor, either to mainland Greece or down to Crete. Again, a discussion about all this, because there's a lot of discussion in prehistory when you don't have that much data to go on. The character of the Neolithic is pronounced regionalism, so most of the essentially Neolithic that you get here in northern Greece or Thessaly or in Macedonia is going to be somewhat different than the Neolithic you get in central or southern Greece, which is not unusual because Greece has always been a country of regions because of the rugged, and it's actually in a similar way as Norway, because of the rugged landscapes that create these insular areas. Throughout Greek history, until very recently, actually, the regionalism has been pronounced. We see that in classical times through the different city-states that had different languages or Greek, but still different dialects of Greek, different alphabets until a certain point, and things like that. So this already starts in the Neolithic. The period is characterized by the agriculture, animal husbandry. Both were brought as part of this Neolithic package from the Near East, mostly cereals, legumes, and then in terms of animals, ovicaprids and likely pigs. There are long-lasting settlements, especially in northern part of Greece here, thousands of years sometimes, in the form of tels. These are mounds that are formed by habitation in one location for prolonged periods of time, which is, now that you think about it, when you say 1,000 years, 7,000 years ago, it doesn't seem that much, but just think in terms of how long has Bergen been here, for example. I mean, so this village in Thessaly existed for twice as much, sometimes. There's been a lot of interaction between different communities, and of course, pottery technology comes in, whether we have a pre-pottery Neolithic in Greece or not, again, a topic of discussion. And then we get to the late and final Neolithic, and this is a very disputed period in terms of chronology, nomenclature, many other things, but everybody agrees it's a very important period because this is the period that lays the foundation in social and technological terms for what comes in the Bronze Age, because this is the time when copper metallurgy gets introduced. This is the time when wheel gets introduced at some point, pack animals, many different changes in technology, but also in society that follow from there happen. Now, what do you call this period? For sake of, it's a very long period, by the way. It's about 1,000 and a half years, depending on where you are. Some people prefer to call it final Neolithic, to emphasize that this is the very end of the Neolithic before we move into the Bronze Age. Other colleagues prefer to call it late Neolithic II, to emphasize the connection with the Neolithic way of life from before. Around Greece, it's called Chalcolithic around here, Neolithic around there, like Copper Age essentially, because the copper gets introduced. If you're really into this, some shameless self-promotion, we organized a conference a few years back and published a very hefty volume. So if you are interested in the 5th and 4th millennia BC around the Aegean, there's a lot of resources there. Now, to get to the site. The site in question that we're excavating now is called Gourimadi. This is a local Arvanitica. It's essentially a medieval Albanian idiom, and the name of the site means literally a big rock, Gourimadi, because you'll see soon there's a big rock on it, and the site actually is formed around the rock throughout its history. It is located on a second largest Greek island, this whole thing here, called Euboea, if you prefer classical pronunciation, or Evia in modern Greek. This island is very close to the mainland, and in fact here, where it's the closest, it's only about 60 meters of a strait between the island and the mainland. Where we're working here, the south part of the island, is quite different. And in fact, in terms of culture, climate, even now, outlook, it resembles more the Cycladic islands to the south than it does the rest of Evia, which is usually lumped together with central Greece, and it's also archaeologically more similar to central Greece. In essence, this area forms an island within an island, so to speak, because it's fairly large in its own right. I forget now, depends how you define it, how big it is, but there are these massive mountains to the north and northwest that separate it from the rest of the island. So in prehistory, in the absence of pack animals, it was probably easier, or at least more productive, to take the boat to go to the rest of the island than to actually walk through the mountains. I mean, this is speculation, but seems that way to me. It's a very diverse area. Geomorphologically, it's a diverse area. It consists of this large massif here. And what we're focusing on now is the two main plains, the plateau called the Caceronio Plain, and then the coastal Caristian Campos. And the area is marked by a big Bay of Charistos flanked by the Gourimadi Peninsula, and the area here that doesn't have a local name, but we call it the Duborovska Peninsula based on the two settlements on both sides. The main town in the area is Charistos. It was an ancient settlement. It's where it is now since late geometric period, so we're probably talking about 8th century so BC, and it's been an independent polis, city-state in the classical times. Then it was conquered by the Persians during the Persian Wars. I don't know how much you are classically inclined, and then became the ally of Athens. But it has been there through the Roman times, through medieval times, until the 1820s, when it was moved slightly closer to the coast. But the settlement still exists there. And we have then this guy, Mount Ohi, which is this fairly large 1,400 meters above sea level mountain that rises, and wherever you go, you see Mount Ohi. So it really marks your experience with this landscape. And our settlement that we're excavating in Gourimadi is here. So it is on a ridge that separates the plateau Caceronio Plain and the plain to the south, the Campos Plain. Now, the location was probably a very important aspect of this, and of the location of the site, or why they chose to put it where they did. And we're going to get to that later, but just to give you a little bit about the background of how we started digging there. We did a project there before this one, an archaeological surface survey called the Norwegian Archaeological Survey in the Christia, or NASC for short, from 2012 and 2016. The project involved a surface collection of finds in the entire Caceronio plain area. Our cutoff boundary was where the inclination of the terrain becomes too steep for unaided agriculture. So agriculture without building terraces. We had to come up with a good cutoff way that seemed the most scientific one. We had a lot of fun with this project. The area we surveyed is 20 or so square kilometers. We did it 10 by 10 meter spacing. So we did a lot of walking over the period of 5 years. It's kind of windy. So the forms were flying the first year, then we decided to switch to tablets, so everything got better. But we found in those 20 square kilometers 99 new archaeological find spots, which is a lot in any area. Greece is an artifact-rich landscape, as you probably know, but even for a landscape like this is a lot. And you can see here the results of the largest find spots marked. These are the boundaries that we were able to determine while we were surveying. And there are these little dots here that you cannot see. They're also small, possibly prehistoric graves. The pink areas here, shaded pink, are the areas that we had to skip for various reasons. For example, this is an industrial kind of zone, not big industry, mind you, but it's quarrying, rock production, things like that. Speaking of rock production, just a fun fact, in case you ever find yourself there, Charistos, claim to fame of Charistos in the Charistia, Sarnevia, is the Cipollino marble. Cipollino marble that was very, very liked by Romans and used everywhere throughout the Roman Empire. And the area of Sarnevia is full of those quarries, Roman quarries still. And some of them have whole massive single columns still in their location. And 80% of all Cipollino in the Roman Empire comes from this area. And it's everywhere. If you've ever been to the Roman Forum, most of the imperial buildings will have this Cipollino. So it's a very interesting archaeological area. It's not only for prehistory that I do, but otherwise. So when we surveyed the plain, you can see here what it looks like, we have found first a large concentration of lithics, which is not unusual because we have a lot of lithics. Lithics mean cheap stone tools in this part of the world. But then after resurveying, we realized that we have a lot of arrowheads, obsidian arrowheads. In fact, we found about 60 of those on the surface only, which is the largest number that I'm aware of found on the surface of any site at that point. So we were slowly leaning towards, this has got to be an important site. We should go and check it further. And then in the last resurvey season, we found this guy, which is a completely preserved copper X. And this is almost pure copper, a little bit of arsenic, which shows that it's a surface find, so we couldn't date it in any other method that we could afford, anyway. But this find, the composition of the metal in the find indicates that it's a very early form of metallurgy. And based on the material that we found, mostly pottery, that we could date based on the style of how it was made, this belongs to the very end of the Neolithic. So we're talking a copper X that was there 200 years maybe after the invention of metallurgy. So it's a very important find. And also, those of you who survey know that you don't find whole copper axes on the surfaces of sites usually. So once we found those, we were like, okay, we got to see what's there. So this is the origin of our project. Of course, the location of the site is very important because in combination with tools that could be interpreted as weapons, and the location that is very defensive, and you can see all around the area, we figured that we might have some evidence for prehistoric conflict. Warfare evidence for this is almost non-existent in Europe. So we decided to proceed. And when I say location, I mean location. It's very, you have to be there to see it, but the view of the area is amazing, not only in terms of aesthetics, but also in terms of how much security it provides you, because you can see everything and everybody coming towards you a long time before they get to you. And I'm not talking only about the land routes, but also the maritime routes. This is the Cycladic Islands in the distance. Unfortunately, I took this photo at a bit of a hazy day, but you can actually see from Gourimadi about 100 kilometers to the south on a really nice day to the Cycladic Islands. And you can see our trenches here and stable points for photogrammetry. Also, see, the location of the site is at the edge of these two zones and at the very edge of the northern Caceronio plain, which is an amazing agricultural resource because it's 20 square kilometers of arable land with water, and water is important in the Cyclades because you don't have much of it. So an ideal location. With the rocks around, it in fact forms a bit of a natural hill fort, so to speak, although we have not found any evidence of any fortification thus far. The fortifications from this period are not unknown, though, so it's a known type of site. Some of our research goals when we started this, believe it or not, was the first systematic excavation of a Neolithic site in Sarnevia, because there's been a lot of work there on prehistory and historical sites, but mostly in the context of rescue excavations. Since there's a lot of construction, it's a touristically active area, but for the lack of interest or funding, excavation targeting prehistoric sites in southern area have not happened. Open air sites, I have to say, because me and my colleague from the Greek Ministry of Culture, Dr. Fanis Mavridis, have actually excavated another site in the area that's a cave site, and we found early Bronze Age burials. But if you're interested, we can talk about it later. Also, based on the material we found on the surface, pottery specifically, because lithics, they do not give you a very fine-grained chronological resolution. Pottery does, at least does it better. We could tell that at least two phases of Greek prehistory was represented there. One is the final Neolithic, and one is the early Bronze Age I. And this transition between the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age I also is poorly documented. Early Bronze Age I as a phase is also not well known and is usually defined in opposition of what it is not than what it is exactly. So we thought this would be a gold opportunity to try to clarify this chronological and stratigraphic relationship. As we found this whole axe, we started immediately thinking metallurgy. Is there any? We have found evidence, there's a lot of evidence for metallurgy from later periods there, mostly iron, but some copper. So we were hoping to find some metallurgical remains or processing or smelting or any other kind of evidence. Spoiler, we didn't find anything, unfortunately, but we did find more metal artifacts. So it was a consumption site rather than a production site. And of course, we wanted to determine the use of the site, especially with the large number of obsidian arrowheads in mind, because they are rarely found. We found a lot of obsidian elsewhere, but not arrowheads. So we had this idea whether this is a hunting camp, or is it warfare, or is it a production site? And of course, explore evidence for prehistoric maritime interactions, because obsidian, as we'll see later, does not come from the area. It comes from elsewhere, from an island south in the Aegean, and the only way you can get it is by sailing to it. So we started, you can see the big rock I'm talking about. And there's a lot of rock in general in the area, so, but this one is specifically marked. When you look at the site, the first thing we did was create a more detailed topographical map of the area that we can use later for spatial analysis. Did some droning, of course. You can see some of our early trenches here. This is the area we were, just to give you an idea. We are fortunate to have this road here that we can actually drive to the site, so it doesn't involve too much walking around and wasting time. Methodologically speaking, we are following fairly standard procedures for work in Aegean prehistory. We are more and more moving away from drawing and any kind of manual recording, and we're using tablets with FileMaker Pro based database connected to our other databases. For example, this one here is the Pottery database, and we use photogrammetry to record features more often than any other method available to us. So just to give you an idea about the progression, this is how we started. This is the site just before we started excavating. It was cleaned about a month before. Otherwise, the vegetation here is this kind of, it's called frigana in Greek. It's shrub, pretty unpleasant. If you happen to step into it, it's a lot of thorns, and you can't do anything with it. You have to really cut it. But you can see here, this is the site before the excavation. So you cannot see it, of course, from this perspective, a lot of material on the surface, pottery and lithics, and literally every time we would go to the site, we would find another arrowhead. So it was full of material, which indicated some kind of cultural presence, longer cultural presence. We weren't sure how much stratigraphy we would find, but we didn't see any walls on the surface whatsoever. We did have a concentration, or rather a scattering of loose rock that we figured would be remains of walls, destroyed walls, rather than just loose rock that came from somewhere else, because mostly you have bedrock in the area. But the moment we started excavating, and this is from the beginning of or I'm not sure if it's beginning, it's the second season, 2019, we have hit some concentrations of rock You can see how we expanded the excavation. More and more architecture coming up. Now that we have a nice picture here of the site. Just want to mention that when we surveyed the site, we have found evidence of archaeological material. Go back, yes. So the site, entire site based on the surface material, goes essentially from the road along this line underneath here and up here. This is our surface scatter. How much of a site this represents, we're not certain, because due to various reasons, surface material can be moved around, spread out. Usually a much smaller area underneath the ground represents the site that produces the material that shows up on the surface. So we figured, though, when we got there, because of how much material we found on the slopes here, this is the summit and these are the slopes, that because of erosion, since the area was deforested probably long ago, there were big deforestation events we know in end of 6th millennium BC, and I think at the late Bronze Age, which is about beginning of the late Bronze Age, which is about 1,500 BC, and later probably because of the construction of shipping, various reasons, but the area was probably deforested for a long time and exposed to erosion, aeolian, water. So we expected most of the stuff to be deflated from the summit of the hill and spread down in into the southern slopes. Of course, if we started digging at the southern slopes, it would give us probably a lot of nice material, we figured, but not much in terms of stratigraphy, which is why we decided to place our trenches at the summit. We didn't expect to find much stratigraphy, and we were wrong, as you will see later, but we at least thought that what we find is going to be intact, and it will be useful for us to reconstruct the occupational history of the site. So this is just, like as I said, run through of the first seasons, and this is where we are now. This is the image, composite image of the trenches we opened so far and the architectural remains we have found so far. So we have, this is our main trench, so to speak, because we positioned it at the very top of the summit. Then we wanted to explore a little bit of the slope, another trench here. Then we kept on expanding based on the realities in the field, as they say. You know, we kept finding architecture. We kept finding more material, so we wanted to see how it goes, and we expanded because of that. And this looks like this in real life. It is a very complex architectural situation here. I don't know if you can see, but we have walls. We have walls on top of walls. We have walls abutting walls. We have weird situations here. There's a wall here, another wall here, then another wall that kind of cuts into this one. A blob here that we call the flower, luludi in Greek, because it looked like a flower, probably a big post hole to support a roof or a second story. Also, most of the walls we find are curved to some degree, which is not unknown from that period, but it's also not that typical. Most of the architecture from the Neolithic in Greece is square. We have different areas. Essentially, we have, with the other side, yes, I mean, this is just a close-up of this section here, for example, just taking from the north. So you can see multiple walls stepping on this wall underneath that was built, probably a entrance way, a sectional wall only on one side preserved, the other side was destroyed. We have a wall here. I mean, a lot of construction, reconstruction, rebuilding, extension. This all shows a continued occupation in one location for a very, very prolonged period of time. And no wonder, because the location was really, really good for various reasons. Now, what came with the walls, we are not sure. typical architecture in Neolithic in Greece and prehistory in general, and even until recently, has been either stone-built sockles, foot on top, mud brick, or completely stone-built houses, often covered with mud or daub to insulate them better. We have found some evidence of daub. This is one example, which is essentially burnt plastering made of mud and other elements, usually straw, sometimes pottery, sometimes small rocks, for plasticity and duration. We don't have that in much, in large quantities, but also we don't have any evidence of burning. And burning is what produces this. Otherwise, this mud, it just melts. If the settlement, for example, was abandoned, we would not have any adobe architecture preserved because it would have just melted after a while. And there's been plenty, in fact, even experimental work done on how well this architecture preserves. But it looks like there was something else going on rather than only stone-built walls. That are, by the way, not built only of stones, but they have some kind of a mortar, mud-based mortar in between, because it's very different from the soil that you excavate, and it contains small pieces of pottery, straw, pieces of rock. So it was something that consolidated the stone-built walls. And we also found different features that show us how some of the spaces were used. And I just want to say, by the way, we are still not entirely clear on what kind of buildings we have there because of so much integration and rebuilding and reconstruction. It is difficult to reconstruct what were the actual buildings. So we are hoping to improve that by expanding a much larger area, and also as we go deeper stratigraphically to tell which walls were older and younger than the others. And in that way, reconstruct individual buildings. Other than the walls, we had, just as an example, here is a remains of a domed oven. It probably looked something like this when it was whole, but you can see this area, actually these are sections of the dome that just collapsed inside. Small one, we didn't find any evidence for how it was used, but likely for cooking or bread making. Definitely not for metallurgy, unfortunately. And then next to it, here, and this is this area, we have found a large, mostly circular, somewhat oval actually, hearth, most likely. And you can see how this thick layer of burning that was produced either by intense heating or a prolonged heating over a long period of time. So evidence for cooking. And also, just this is me in the deepest trench that we have found so far. And this is, let's go back, give you an illustration. This is this area here. So as I said before, we didn't expect to find much. We were hoping for maybe, if we're lucky, 50 to 60 centimeters of stratigraphy. And so far, we are in this section, this is trench 5, at 1.9 meters. And we have found bedrock nowhere. So we're starting to wonder, where is it? Because it's all around us. We can see it before we started excavating, but all of a sudden, the stratigraphy just goes on and on. Outside for the funny picture, I also wanted to show you this thing. If I have a better, go back. Pottery is always the largest file. Yeah, there you go. All right. So this is a structure here. I don't know, it doesn't look much, but at the very base of this trench, which we are going to expand, and this is one of our goals for this summer, we have found a structure, and these here are postholes. A structure made of clay, some of it partially burnt. Now, as you see, most of the architectural elements in the rest of the site and in Neolithic, in this part of the Aegean, of this part of Greece, are stone built. So finding this kind of clay-built structure, and we don't know what it is because this is not a very large space here. I mean, you can maybe see it. It's like a meter by half a meter at the end of the excavation. Is very important because this is a unique, one of those things that made the site unique. It's a unique architectural feature for prehistory of this southern area for sure, but also this part of Greece in general. It's not a usual find. What it is, we hope to find out. But the important thing to take out of this is that the stratigraphy continues, and we'll see where it's going to end. It's probably not going to be indefinite, of course, but we have found a lot more in terms of cultural layers than we expected. Now, I won't bore you too much with the pottery. The stuff we find is fairly typical of the final Neolithic in Greece and late Neolithic. Ceramic, you have open and closed vessels. Mostly we're talking about bowls and jars. Many of them not that well made, which is a feature of this final Neolithic period. Earlier Neolithic ceramic in Greece is much, much finer, but it was probably made in much smaller quantities. And then we have towards the end of the Neolithic, an expansion of this more industrial kind of production, depending on who you ask. Some people argue that it's because of pottery being actually starting to, for the first time, to be used as a utilitarian object. And before that, it was connected to other uses, possibly ritual. But the stuff we find is fairly typical. Most of it, as I said, decoration doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it consists of incised incisions, of grooves, sometimes punctuated clay body, sometimes grooves and punctuations are filled with whitish paste. It's also typical for this period. You see here actually these guys are remains of mat, a reed mat, or whatever it was made mat, on which the still non-fired pots were left to dry. So they left an impression. We have several of those. They're pretty cool, I think, and also can tell us much about the process. And we have these guys, which again are not very pretty, but they're very interesting because they're called cheese pots, and we don't know what they were used for. You find them all over. They're very typical for the final Neolithic. They can be fairly large, fairly shallow, and they have perforations all around the rim. So a colleague who found them first many years ago called them cheese pots because he thought that these holes might have been used to pour off whey when you make cheese. We don't know, but I have a colleague now who's planning to do organic residue analysis on all these to see what they were actually used, because we found them everywhere. So it's possible at least that not only one, they didn't have only one use. And then we have this kind of stuff, and this kind of stuff is very important. This is actually the earliest kind of pottery that we find in this part of Greece. This part of Greece is unusual because, as I said, it is essentially geographically part of central Greece, where you have Neolithic from the early, middle, late. In the Cycladic Islands, Neolithic comes later. At least we haven't found any evidence. Although there have been Mesolithic, there has been late Paleolithic, even maybe even middle Paleolithic. We find no evidence for early and middle Neolithic, and only we have this, what's usually considered to be a population movement in the islands towards the late Neolithic. And this is associated with this population movement. So why is this important? It's important because southern area, because of this location, is often considered to be one of the springboards for this movement and this first permanent settlement of the Cycladic Islands. So sites from this period are rare, and this is in fact the only site that we have in southern area outside of a cave. The same cave where we found the early Bronze Age remains, we also found this kind of late Neolithic pottery, but the site is not a habitational one. And this is the first time that we found pottery this early in this part of Greece. And not only that, but first time we have evidence for a settlement from this period in this part of Greece, which could be connected to the movement to the Cycladic Islands, but also two different types of pottery. So these guys are somewhat chronologically distant, but mostly they are culturally distant, because this kind of pottery, it's called white on dark, is associated with the Cycladic cultural circle. You know, we call it also Zarko, based on this little islet that was first found. And this matte painted, so-called, is more typical for the central Greece and northern Greece. So what we have here in Sarnevia, we have some kind of a cultural syncretism, and for the first time we have evidence of this early material, and since we haven't found anywhere bedrock, maybe even earlier material. So I get very excited about this, I have to say. I mean, I know for most of you might not be something, but it's incredibly important because it gives us another piece of the puzzle of how the Cyclades were settled. And since I do island archaeology and how societies develop in insular conditions, this is very important for me, personally. Other than pottery, we have a lot of obsidian. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. So far, we have found only in the excavation about 7,000 pieces, not counting the small ones, just the big stuff. And we have everything there. We have everything from, we have the entire, as they call it, chaîne opératoire, the entire reduction sequence, except for the actual raw nodules that they would have brought to the site. So we have cores. This is a depleted blade core. We have these little chunks here, the flakes. We have blades, and we have obsidian arrowheads. And at the moment, we have about 250 of them. And this is, I mean, hopefully nobody that's watching this has a better number because not everything is published. But as far as I know, this is the largest number of obsidian arrowheads ever found on any site in Greece. Now, why we have so many arrowheads? Because we have the entire chaîne opératoire, we know that we have production on the site. Of course, production doesn't exclude use. I mean, it didn't have to be only a production site. So it stands to reason that the arrowheads were produced to be used on the site. One of our hypotheses was that, okay, it was a big hunting camp, but most of the animal bones we found there are from domesticated animals. So you don't kill a pig or a goat with an arrowhead. Maybe they did back then, but we don't have any evidence. Most of the other sites with domesticated animals did not have arrowheads. We have a couple of bones belonging to a deer, a hare, a rabbit, but not enough to justify why would you need so many arrowheads. And other sites with a large number of arrowheads, the one that I know of is actually in Western Greece. They're mostly made of other lithics, other raw materials, not obsidian, are actual hunting camps because they, more than 50% of the animal bones you find on them are actually belong to wild game, while here it's all domesticated. So we started thinking that maybe in addition to production, and in combination with the location and other evidence that can point to conflict, we have some evidence or at least preparation for conflict situations. Now, obsidian is also evidence of maritime interactions because obsidian doesn't exist in Sarnevia. In fact, obsidian sources are rare in the Aegean, and we have, I'm aware of 3 actually. There's one here on an island called Yali, close to the Aegean Minor. There's a small source of really bad obsidian close to Antiparos, but most of the obsidian used in Neolithic Aegean comes from one single source, and this is the island of Milos. Island of Milos is about 130 kilometers as the crow flies from Sarnevia. To get to it, did I have a, yes I did. You had to have taken a boat. So it's concrete, direct evidence for maritime interactions. How frequent these interactions were is a different question, but they happened because there was no other way to do it. And based on evidence that I'm not going to go into now, the prevailing interpretation of how people would obtain the raw material at the moment is that they actually went there, because there are no big settlements controlling the access to the obsidian quarries on the island of Milos. So most people agree these days that people who needed to use it went there to use it, to obtain it and then make it into tools. And it is not at least in the area that we're talking about now, it is not a rare material because this circle around here, more or less, relies on obsidian. Relies on obsidian up to 90, in Scandinavia, we have 98% of all lithic tools were made of obsidian. Now, we have some sources of flint here, pretty poor flint, but they are definitely closer sources of other raw materials. So it was a cultural decision to get on a boat and go down to the island. And this is a trip of a week, maybe even 2 weeks. It's a cultural endeavor. Just think of Kula Ring, for example. You know, they would have taken the boat from one island to the other, stopped by, replenished supplies. The boats were pretty small. This is actually a representation of an early Bronze Age Aegean boat. Got the obsidian and then traveled back. So this is direct evidence of cultural decision. And these actually pieces are all from Scandinavia. There's a big chunk, cortical flake, a really nice large core. It's about this big. And this is only from one side from the surface. It's about 8,000 pieces here. If you've ever seen 8,000 pieces of obsidian, this is it. Now, why engage in maritime interactions in Aegean? Without getting into detail again, the prevailing interpretation, the prevailing reasoning is that necessity makes people do it. Community is too small for genetic reproduction, so assuming there's some kind of a taboo on incest, you know, they would need to go somewhere else to get their mates. Absence of raw materials and other resources, for example, metals or Cycladic islands are generally poor in arable land, so food. As I say, insufficient arable land, so social storage, you go into another place, make friends, your crop fails, there doesn't, you go and get some food, and just sheer proximity. Now, based on Charistos, we have evidence for very strong population, so no need to seek out mates. We have raw materials there, definitely raw materials closer than going to Milos, a lot of arable land, and the island is not that close to the rest of the Cyclades, actually, because it's 40 square kilometers to one side, and not square kilometers, 40 kilometers on one side and 12 kilometers on the east side, except you have to cross something called Cape Caphireus, which is known for bad weather and strong winds. To go back to Gourimadi, we also find evidence of different activities. We have these little, several of these small polystone tools. Usually they are considered to have been used for working soft materials, so bone, leather, things like that. We have evidence of cooking. This is a very nice ladle or a spoon. Obsidian shell, spondylus shell. I have obsidian on my mind constantly, as you can see. Spondylus shell, it's commonly used to make jewelry and ornaments in the Aegean prehistory. This one doesn't seem to be altered in any way, and we need to analyze to see whether it was used for something else, as a receptacle, for example. We have some small pieces of ochre, which is not that common in Neolithic. We have figurines, animals and humans, indicating some kind of a symbolic meaning, religious life, you name it. And then this picture didn't come out right. This guy here is like another complete piece of metal artifact. It's an awl. It's like a tool used to punch through something, probably leather, for example. And it was likely attached to a wooden or antler, or likely wooden because it disappeared, handle. Because one side is very sharp, the other one is kind of dull. But this is the first time we find metal, again, not produced, but used in the context of the archaeological context. And who were the people? We don't know, but we have one skull belonging to a young girl, probably a teenager, only the skull, nothing else. And we found it in an area that we usually considered, or have considered until then, still consider actually to be a refuse. So somebody threw away a skull. It's possible. It's not unusual to find human remains in unusual situations in Greek prehistory, for example, in boundary ditches or similar situations. When cleaning the profile on one of the trenches closest to there, we have found also a piece of a femur, top of the femur that was fairly gracile, so could have been belonging to the same person, we don't know. But the skull was very friable, so we decided to just take it as you see it here and put it in a box and let it wait for a proper micro-excavation. Now, what is Gourimadi really? It's a very important site, and I said unique because I was kind of pressed to come up with a title for this, and I said unique, but it is unique in many ways. So it's one of the few sites that potentially bridges this Neolithic and Early Bronze Age transition, and it's very important because we have few of those, and far between all over the Aegean, not only in this area. It is, well, I say here possibly, but now we are certain that this is the earliest open-air site in southern Evia, in this part of the Aegean, and whatever that also implies. I say one of the largest because I don't want to offend anybody, but I think it's the largest concentration of obsidian arrowheads in the Aegean. So according to our lithics expert, it must have been a nodal point in prehistoric obsidian exchange, which is a very important thing because it was a major exchange, especially when you have that used as a raw material, but thousands of people throughout the islands. Massive architectural remains with multiple phases, also not something you find often. Whether there was a role in peopling of the Cyclades, we don't know, but hopefully we'll find out once we do DNA testing on human skeletons, also animal skeletons, because you can see where animals have traveled, because they have traveled with people. And we may have evidence for conflict or warfare in prehistory based on the location, on the material evidence we find, even based on architecture, because it's pretty massive architecture, so it could have had a defensive purpose as well. Now, what makes it unique, to go back to this, locally, the earliest evidence of human presence in the Aegean, in this part of the Aegean, and it's also the first systematically excavated site in this part of Greece, as I said, and I cannot emphasize how important this is, because rescue excavations tend to be done well, but they only focus on small sections of the sites. They are immediately in danger of being destroyed, so they don't give us a full picture. And I really want to commend the Greek colleagues for doing all they can with limited resources in these situations. But without proper targeted excavation, scientific excavation, it's impossible to proceed. And again, important production site of Obsidian. But on the scale of the Aegean, again, we have architectural remains from this period. They're not unknown. But on this scale and on this complexity, they're very few and far between. Largest concentration of obsidian arrowheads probably in Greece, and uninterrupted stratigraphic sequences keeps going and could continue into the middle Neolithic. Now, just to mention briefly, this site, although it is not an official field school, is also used to train students of archaeology from University of Bergen, from Greek universities, American universities as well. And I have the good fortune of working with some really amazing people that know their stuff well. And anybody who comes to the project benefits from them. Now, what we train people in depends on who shows up, because especially during COVID years, some specialists could make it, some specialists couldn't. We did what we could. But we were able to do uninterrupted excavation on the site even through the COVID years with some safety measures, and nobody got sick, which is great. I'm very happy about that. And before I conclude, I just want to thank everybody. I mean, our archaeologists here know that archaeology doesn't happen in isolation. So I'm actually very fortunate to work with some amazing people. Many of them I'm happy to call my friends. But I especially want to thank the institutions that have supported this project, whether in terms of permit or finances, and the members of the local community that have been there for us from the very beginning, and particularly my colleagues Pasalis Zafiriadis and Fanis Mavridis, my project co-director, and my good friends Denitsa Nenova and Hussein Ostruk, without whom this project would have been impossible and definitely less fun. And then other colleagues like Katerina Psumaiva and Levine and other specialists that have worked there. Whoever is watching this, I know I'm missing somebody, and I beg for your apology. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. You showed these structures, and you were not quite sure if they were kind of fortifications and it was dwellings, huts, but you tend to believe that it's something with fortification. Is that
If I understand correctly, I mean, the fortifications are actually not unique from this area. This is when the time when they start appearing fortifications in the Aegean, end of the Neolithic. And they become pretty common in the early Bronze Age. We don't have those kind of fortifications on this site because they're fairly typical. They consist of thick walls with bastions, rounded bastions. What we do have here, I still believe that we're mostly dealing with habitational architecture. But in many cases, and you can see this, for example, in Greece, in situations from the Middle Ages, sometimes you build your house with the outer wall that's thicker in case somebody comes and tries to burn it. So it's possible that some of these were intended to be defensive, but not built as defensive architecture.
Okay. But you said that it was kind of long period of time. Do you get this kind of accumulation levels to time, or did they kind of remove things, or are the finds getting younger and younger upwards in succession?
Yeah, correct. They get well, they get older and older the deeper we go, because we kind of excavate.
So they're building on top of each other?
Yes, yes. It's all stratigraphy. We have not found so far any evidence for hiatus. So, I mean, these things are difficult to spot. So I wouldn't, bet my life on it.
It's kind of surprising to see that on this top pair that everything was, you didn't see any structures on the surface, and you have to dig
No.
to find.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that, how could it be Aegean, but it didn't look like there were stones and pebbles in them. It didn't look like windblown stuff. So could
No.
this be just remains of the walls, the mud in the walls that collapse into
Yeah.
the Hudson,
Oh.
and in that way,
There's that as well, for sure. I mean, this is how stratigraphic sequence is formed, by use and then collapse. So some of it is not use layers. We have identified a couple of use layers, actually floors, for example, where the hearth is, and the oven. We have another layer in one part of the trench where we have hit the floor because we found objects on the floor. But stratigraphic sequence consists of accumulation not only of activities but also of destruction. So it's not all activity. But we don't have any evidence that it was interrupted in terms of, we don't have any, for example, layers with no finds at all, so far.
how long time was it?
At the moment, we're looking at least 1,000 a year of habitation, maybe 1,500.
Not a set of fortification,
Mhm.
fortified setting.
Mhm.
Now the circular
Mm-hmm.
constructions, very few huts, hundreds of huts, things like that. Or
You mean the stone built? Let me get actually one of the, if I can get quickly to. Those are, I mean, the way we interpret them, and this is how we usually see them in other sites in Greece from this period and later. These are all evident, these are all parts of structures, of houses.
would it be circular houses?
Yeah, I mean, yes, they're not common as I said, but they do appear. Almost there. It's a very large file. Okay, now too much. So, what the? We're getting there. All right. So these are all parts of structures. I mean, this is pretty large. And this trench, for example, this is 7 by 4 here. So this is like a large structure. This was a large structure. We are assuming this is an inside because this is where we found a hearth and an oven. An oven built of clay is unlikely to survive outside because it would melt with the rain. There is rain in Greece as well. I mean, especially at that time, it was probably wetter. These are also parts of different structures. There's a platform here. We don't know what it was served, how it was used yet, but it abuts the walls that are kind of intersecting here. So these are all structures. There's a wall here, for example. The big rock is this section here, for example, and there's a small rock above here. So there's a wall that was probably going against the natural rock. So these are all parts of structures. Now, how they were used and what structure specifically, because I've not seen a structure that would create an S wall so far. So this is probably two different structures, but from what periods? I mean, it's likely that this went like this, and then a later, this is one of our trench 4, a small one, but this is a wall here that kind of continues on top. So all of these are parts of structures. Now, how big is the settlement that we're looking at here? We don't know until we excavate a much larger area. We tried doing geophysical research. It's too much rock to see anything, the ones that we could afford actually. So we don't know, but it could be a hamlet, it could be a large farm site, it could be a small settlement.
Can I just ask a question about
Sure.
this lower structure here? You have this circular thing,
Mhm.
and then you have this cutting through.
Yes.
And that's, so this is, it's kind of strange that this is not removed, but this must be younger than this.
This is what we thought, but it looks like actually this was built against it because there are some things that kind of go into it. You know, if this would cut the wall that's circular, we had a long discussion about this. I was on your side. I thought this cut through the wall, but I was persuaded otherwise. So this was actually a later wall that was abutting this wall.
So this is a later
Yes.
wall than
Yes.
this. Okay.
And this is a multiple structure as well because this is a wall here, and there is a wall underneath here that's only partially uncovered, and then there was a section of the wall that kind of goes like this on top of the wall here. So this one, say, the stratigraphy is complex.
And I was actually thinking about that as my next question.
Hmm.
You mentioned if these are circular rods, and you
Mhm.
say that the floor level could be down here and not sunken rods, but at least it's deeper down there.
Mhm.
I think it would be, why don't they level up the area every time they have a new building phase? Because it's very hard to use this with this wall in it, or this one with that wall in it, or this one with this wall in it.
Yeah, I agree.
How the hell do you
I
really think
agree.
of that?
Yeah, I agree.
Unless the floor layer would be up here, but it's not because you have the room down there.
No, it was down there. The hearth level was on this level here, actually. It's a bit deeper now than it was before. But yeah, I agree with you. And this is something they often done. This is how you create tells, by leveling and then building, level and building. They just continued adding. And I mean, why here? Why, for example, this wall and then exactly the same wall next to it?
Do I understand you right, that you are not at the very base yet?
No.
You're still over the lake.
Yes.
below.
Yes.
So you don't know how deep the stone structures, you don't know if they go.
I mean, some of them we know. Like, for example, this ends on top of this one, and it's a different orientation, different period. Yeah. So, like this wall stands on top of that wall. You know, and we have similar situations elsewhere. Things that are cutting through the walls. That, for example, this was built against it. We have a couple of situations where we know where this architecture started or ended, depends how you look at it. But these guys, for example, this continues. This platform stops, and then there's soil. And then we found this.
If you scale it, there is 2 meters down there, so it's very small structures.
Oh, yeah, relatively, but it's not unusual. I mean, you know, we don't have those kind of large structures that you have in the Neolithic or Central Europe. Those kind of common houses that you would have later in, you know, Viking periods here. Most of the habitations are small. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people have tried. The thing is that it's spotty. I mean, most of the architectural remains of Neolithic in this part of the world are square structures. So people have usually interpreted non-square structures as non-habitational structures. You know, because when you look at, for example, Skara Brae in Scotland, I mean, it's Neolithic layer, of course, but you know, you have all these round houses. Round houses are not that common over there, so they've interpreted, you know, on an island, 2 islands over, it's been interpreted as a maybe of silos. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good question, actually. This is what I've been kind of grappling myself for a while. This is most of the sites that we know of from this period that are probably habitational are coastal. Because being on the coast and being able to interact with people and go places was important. Mind you, fishing was not that important. We have found almost no evidence of fishing. Meat and potatoes all the way. No potatoes, of course, they came later, but you know, domesticated foods, very little evidence for fishing. And from early Bronze Age burials that we excavated in the area, we did stable isotope analysis, and they didn't need much fish. So, but coastal location was important clearly for culture and other reasons, commercial, whatever it is. So most of the sites that we know of, the problem is, as I said, this is the only, in this area, excavated prehistoric site. So most of the other sites we know of are known from surface material and the surveys. So I cannot really say. We have a lot of obsidian everywhere, but not arrowheads. We have sites, many of the prehistoric sites we found during the survey is nothing but obsidian. And we usually connect them to, or I personally connect them, I have disagreements with my colleagues about this, but I connect them to maybe some activities related to agriculture, since they are usually found in the plains. They intentionally perhaps left these large swaths of land free of habitation so they can use them. In terms of everything else, we don't have, other than obsidian, which is a clearly raw material that comes from elsewhere. Copper sources exist in the area. We have no evidence that they were used in prehistory. They've been definitely exploited in the Roman times. And at the moment, we didn't do the analysis to see if these objects were made of local copper. So this is also possibly another evidence of connections. And material culture, the way we find it, I mean, for example, pottery, it seems to be mostly made of local clays. Based on, we didn't do petrography yet, but based on our experiences and the petrography we did do in other sites. So what the relation is within the region, I cannot say for sure. It's based on the location and how much of the material there is. It's an important site. But I really cannot tell you now, since we don't have any other excavated settlements from this period. And from, you know, from the period that we only found a few pieces of, that we know now is the oldest, but also from majority of the material comes from this later stage of the Neolithic that is commonly found in the area, but again, unexcavated. Yes, yes, about, yeah, it's definitely from somewhere else, because the only flint we have in the area has been identified. I've seen a piece, it's greenish, it's very distinct, and it's really bad. So the flint that we have is about 1 and something% of all the lithics that we find in the area. Comes from somewhere else. There are some pieces, something called the honey flint, that we don't know the sources. Most likely it comes from northern Greece, that's the consensus. There are other types of flint, this reddish kind of stuff, or brownish, that is more common throughout central Greece, but in very, very small amounts. And we only have one, I think, arrowhead that's not made of obsidian. So it's evidence of some kind of contact, but probably not very frequent ones. Oh, it's possible. I have a whole talk about that, the frequency of contact and how it's important or based on frequency on social. Yeah, but this is probably one of those things that happened. You know, we came with the boat, we need to replenish our water. There's got to be some kind of interaction protocol, you know, communication protocol. Is a present, you know, then you would give not something that's super valuable, but something that's, you know, a curiosity maybe, because obsidian, I mean, obsidian is a very good material. It creates really, really sharp edges, but also it breaks more easily than flint. So it's, you know, much sharper, but a lot less durable.
You haven't conversations with your experience with this site, or and another question is this curved structure. Is this could be a corollary to later circular buildings in Bronze Age and further on, since this is very rare, as you mentioned?
Could be. I mean, most of the circular structures in the Bronze Age later are connected to funerary arrangements. There are the tombs and things like that. So I'm not sure if there's a direct connection in that respect. But it could be an inspiration. I cannot say. As far as ritual activity is concerned, we only guess based on the finds of the figurines, human figurines. Now, they have been notoriously difficult to interpret without going into pure speculation, what they were used and how they were used. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, really, because we didn't find them in any particular context. They usually found in Greek Neolithic and on this site in everywhere. Habitation, refuse, you know, there was no like a section that would have all the figurines. I mean, it happens sometimes. Some figurines have been found in clusters, in compositions as foundation deposits in the Balkan Neolithic. We have no evidence for that now. Not that many. We have 4, I think. 4 human and another 3, I think, animal.
But very few people can live into that.
Yes, but it's warm. It's the Mediterranean, so most of your living doesn't happen inside houses throughout the year.
I'm still not understanding. You're saying that this is younger, and you're saying that this was the occupation site there?
This is the inside of one of the buildings, this level here.
And this is the scale here, so it's
Yes.
only 1.5 meters?
Well, no, because I think this actually, get out of the way, I think this is actually more of a structure here that we're looking at.
Yeah, but the floor is deep down, and this, as he said, this is sticking up into the half dam.
One thing you have to do is, as this is a sediment area, you can't have big holes, almost 2 meter deep lying around, so you would have to wait to build the next phase when you have filled that up with soil. And I mean, it wasn't just that phase, it was also the outside that had to be filled up with soil.
Right.
But you can't afford people
Yeah.
going down 2 meters deep.
No, but
So there's a lot of building up soil here. Where does that come from?
yeah, I mean, okay, the whole is the future of the excavation. How the site formation went is a different thing. I mean, I'm sure they didn't leave holes unless they were refuse holes. But so we talk between here and here, we have 500-600 years. You know, so it could have been filled out naturally if there's a hiatus that we didn't see. And I'm not saying that there isn't. It's just difficult to see. It could have been filled in with other stuff. We didn't find much debris, for example, that would imply artificial leveling. We have a lot of debris here. This is where we found the skull, for example. And we have a lot of debris here that we always looked at this area as a refuse area because small pieces of pottery, small pieces of rock, small pieces of bone, even human. But the others, I mean, it's difficult to tell. We have not figured this out yet. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks.